most of my books are about right-wing extremists.
Hmm.
Uh, that's that was my day job, and I wrote of Orcas and Men partly to get away from that. And we can talk about that. But yes, it's and now that I'm retired, I'm working on a book about humpback whales
Oh, that's
because
cool.
I enjoyed doing the orca book so much, and I really don't want to write about Nazis anymore. So
Well, now that Orca book is kind of you wrote that like several years ago, right?
yeah, 2015 is when it came out.
Wow. Okay. And
Yeah, so we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of it. Yeah, and it still sells really well.
yeah,
So.
do
It's my only book. For some reason, it's the only book I've written that people come up to and say, "I love that book." They don't say that my book about hate crimes and stuff like that.
yeah, I was gonna ask, do you still get people that ask you questions about orcas and ask you about your book?
Oh yeah, I do a lot of discussion. I've been talking about orcas a lot lately because of the whole thing and uh, uh, Gibraltar with the Gibraltar orcas. So I've been getting some interviews about that. I stay, I go out and because I live here on San Juan Island, I go out and see them when they're around and go out on whale watches and I talk, I'm friends with the scientists who actually study them here on the island. And so um, I stay in that world very much because, yeah, I'd rather hang out with whales than Nazis any old day.
Is or are these whales? Is this related to a news story I heard about how some orcas are attacking boats in that
Yeah.
area?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. In Gibraltar, Strait of Gibraltar, there's a pod of orcas that have been attacking sailboats and ripping off their rudders. And everyone's going, yeah, yay, orcas attack the rich guys, but it's not that. It's not working like that. That's not what it's about. And they're not intentionally sinking these boats. They're playing with the rudders, and when they play with the rudders, they'll rip them out and create holes in the hulls of the boats, and they sink. Um,
Jeez.
so yeah, it's crazy stuff, and it's just a group of you know uh, adolescent males. Mostly as far as we can tell, they're all not fully adult males, and they're all in the same pod. So and it seems to be a game they've come up with is to play with the rudders on these sailboats. So and we've observed this before. So um, with them not necessarily playing with rudders, although they have been known to do that. But they have developed these fads
Hmm.
where they do this behavioral stuff that they all sort of imitate and replicate within the pod. A few years ago, we had orcas wearing salmon on their heads. And nobody knew why they were doing it. And it was a fad that lasted a couple of years. They go around parading a salmon up on their rostrum, and and then they stopped doing it. So lately, there's been a fad with them playing with crab pots, moving crab pots out here in the waters around here. So
Uh,
um,
really quick, David, before we continue, I want to give you a proper introduction.
sure.
Hi, everybody out there. My name is Chris. This is Chee-Tash, and today I'm joined by author, investigative journalist David Neiwert. Am I pronouncing your last name
No,
correctly?
it's Neiwert.
Neiwert. Okay, I apologize about that.
No
David,
worries.
yeah, David, am I missing anything? Author, investigative journalist, anything else you want to add?
No, that's yeah. I live, Pacific Northwest resident, whatever. Long time Southern Poverty Law Center writer, but I write about whales to keep in touch with what matters.
And
So
We were mentioning this earlier when we were talking that this book of Orcas and Men like kind of deviates from what your other books are about. And I know you kind of mentioned this earlier, but what was the reason for you writing this book compared to like your other topics in your other books?
Yeah, well, as I was saying, most of my other books deal with right-wing extremism in various forms, hate crimes, hate groups, militias, that sort of thing. Um, I started out freelancing in the 1990s. I was an environmental reporter. That was my background, and I basically developed sort of two story tracks when I was starting to freelance. I did started writing about militias organizing here in the Northwest as a story about anti-environmental backlash that was organizing in the region. And then at about the same time, I started writing about killer whales up here because they're kind of the consummate Northwest environmental story. They embody so much of the environmental issues that we're facing here in the Northwest, including, salmon, pollution, overpopulation, that sort of thing, and how it affects these animals. So I'd written a lot of stories over the years about them as it happened after Oklahoma City happened, I wound up being one of the only reporters who'd gone out and talked to these militiamen out in the woods around here. Wound up becoming a militia expert on TV. Um, and I had a lot more of that work over the years. In fact, I wound up working for the Southern Poverty Law Center for quite a few years. And but that was my day job. That was more or less filling the bill. I can tell you it was not pleasant work. And at the same time, I kept writing about killer whales. And let me tell you, that was very pleasant work. Gave me a chance to go camping, go out kayaking, be around the whales, get out in nature and see what they're about. And yeah, and explore. I started out in college as a biology major, and so it was a chance to sort of pull in my science background in my writing. And frankly, it was also a chance to be myself when I write. Most of my books about extremists are, deadly, dull, serious because it's a very serious subject and you can't approach it with, I've tried to weave some humor in, but it's I was able to much more be myself in writing about the Ark book, and I think you'll agree that it has a fair amount of humor woven into it. So,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, it was a lot more fun to write. Certainly a lot more fun to sell. And yeah, I'm gradually returning to the subject now. I'm kind of working up a proposal to do a book about humpback whales up here in the Salish Sea. So
Is there a reason why these whales, like particularly orcas, are very prominent in that area versus, like as an example, I don't really hear much about orcas being in Florida or the Carolinas or on the East Coast at all.
it's not real clear. Orcas exist in every ocean on the planet, and sometimes, as in up here in the Northwest, you'll have two or three separate ecotypes existing in contiguous or the same waters. And so it's not really clear why they're here, other than that there is a huge abundance of food for them, for both ecotypes. So that is the mammal-eating killer whales that eat seals and sea lions, as well as the fish-eating orcas, who up until the last 50 years or so had this huge abundance of Chinook salmon that were very large, very fatty, full of lipids, and were became their targeted food. Um, and we know that they started populating these waters when the glaciers receded at the end of the ice age. and and that's when they, sort of evolved this focus on their prey focus was Chinook salmon. So it's not really clear why they evolved this way, except that every ecotype on the planet, including Antarctic orcas or Indian Ocean orcas, um, are they develop cultures built around the requirements of their prey. The bigs, the transient orcas that we have up here, really only live in pods of 5 to 7, and they have some dispersal of males as they age. Um, because they need to be sneaky. They need to be very surreptitious when they're hunting seals and sea lions. That's the only way, that's the way they can get them. Whereas the fish-eating orcas have no need to be sneaky. And so they will have pods, 20 to 30 orcas sometimes. And there's no dispersal. They remain with their family units their entire lives. So like I say, the prey that's available to them does a lot to shape their cultures. There are orcas in the Caribbean. Not sure why there are not orcas on the eastern seaboard. There certainly were orcas for many years up in Maine, and still are, I believe. North Atlantic orcas are known, but yeah, we don't see many orcas there in the mid-Atlantic. It's not really clear why, but it's possible that they just don't have any prey, um, or anything that would necessarily attract a population of them and could sustain a population of orcas. So, um, and it's very possible, if not likely, that they did exist there at one time and then just kind of filtered away as the prey base was destroyed. And particularly Atlantic salmon, they used to be highly abundant on the whole eastern seaboard, and that population got wiped out in the first couple hundred years of white population on the continent.
Now the different ecotypes that you mentioned, like transients and residents, do they like each other or do they get along with
No,
each other? Yeah.
no, they have no cultural interaction whatsoever. The residents tend to chase the transients out of their waters, and the transients seem to do their best to avoid the residents as possible. Not seen any hostility other than raking when they do encounter each other. But they have no, none of their communications, the vocalizations that orcas share within their pods and within their populations. There's no crossover with the residents, and in fact, or with the transients, I should say. Um, and the genetic tests that they've done indicate that these animals have not had any genetic interaction in over 300,000 years, which is longer than human beings have been on the planet. So,
And no matter the ecotype, I remember you wrote this in your book. Mothers are really important in the orca pods. Like,
yeah.
and what is it? They tend to stick with their mothers for their lives.
Oh yeah. No, it's very much matriarchal culture and society. They everything revolves around the mothers. The mothers lead the pods to wherever the food is, or more dramatically and importantly, the postmenopausal females, the grandmothers, are the ones who tend to direct the pod to hunting grounds. Um, so yeah, it's called the granny hypothesis, and it's been pretty much substantiated that yeah, these postmenopausal females in orcas are, they play a really key and important role in their survival, and by being repositories of knowledge for where to find fish or find their prey. And And they are long lived, you know. Granny J2, who passed away in 2016, was believed to be about 100 years old when she passed on. And she was the great leader of the southern resident population. And since then, the main matriarch has been L25, Ocean Sun, who's believed to be about 85 years old. So they're quite long lived. And that, yeah, and once they reach menopause, they become the real leaders of the pods and direct everybody on where to go. It's fascinating, and you know, there's the fascinating stuff is actually things that I wasn't able to include in my book because it was research that's been published since the book was. But yes, the whole granny hypothesis thing is built around the fact that there are really only three species of animals on the planet that have menopause, and that's killer whales, pilot whales, and humans. And so the question was, and we still don't really have a clear picture of why humans evolved menopause. Um, there are a lot of hypotheses, but it's not really clear. And so these whale scientists examined, you know, well, why do killer whales, why did they evolve menopause? And it was clearly because the presence and sort of cultural or high role that they played in the cultures of these postmenopausal females enabled the orcas to have these repositories of knowledge, have these basically sort of social leaders who would be able to remember from year to year where to go and what time of year to be in certain places and that sort of thing. And their you know their argument is that humans, if you look at hunter-gatherer societies in humans, that menopause, which is when menopause more or less evolved in humans, that females also, these are probably matriarchal societies as well. They certainly held higher roles in hunter-gatherer societies than they were relegated to in what we think of as modern human society.
How far back does human history go back with orcas? Like, have us and orcas been kind of interlinked for a while?
Yeah, well, they certainly, I mean, mostly I think it's interesting to compare the two because we do have so many similarities. We're apex predators like they are. Um, we are not the natural prey of very many other animals. You know, we can be killed by other animals as sometimes orcas can be too, but not really often. I mean, there's nobody that really can hunt and kill an orca. They hunt and kill great white sharks. So just to put a perspective on that, but that's has a lot to do with their size and incredible power that they have. You know, an adult male orca is 32 feet long, weighs 14,000 pounds, has a 6 foot dorsal fin, and you know, the largest great white shark ever recorded was 5,000 pounds. So, which is still smaller than, you know, an average female orca, which is typically around 8,000 pounds.
Hmm.
So, yeah, and so you do have a lot of, we have a number of shark eating orca populations out there, including New Zealand, and actually about 100 miles off the west coast here in the Northwest and out in the Pacific, we have a population we call the offshores, and they hunt sleeper sharks that live down in the trenches, and they go and hunt those things and rip their livers out.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
And I I apologize if this is like basic, well-known information, but orcas are is the word cetaceans?
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
they're definitely cetaceans. I mean, some people will say, oh, well, they're not whales, they're dolphins. And it's like, no, actually, all dolphins are whales.
Oh,
A
okay.
whale is a generic term for large cetacean. And it applies both to baleen whales, the mysticetes, the humpback whales and blue whales, that have the baleen plates, as well as animals that are as small as, I mean, pilot whales are smaller than orcas, but they're whales, right? And have been known as whales for all of the time we've been naming them. Um, and taxonomically speaking, all dolphins are subsets of the odontocetes, who are, they're toothed whales. So, and yeah, the killer whales are the largest species of dolphin. They're, they come from the same sort of taxonomy as bottlenose dolphins. And there's real similarities there in their brain structures and that sort of thing, except that um, orcas are like bottlenose dolphins on steroids. They're just 10 times bigger and 10 times more powerful at everything than dolphins are.
That was one thing I was going to ask you on that comparison between dolphins and orcas in the realm of intelligence. Because growing up, I always heard that, oh, dolphins are way smarter than us. And then in your book, you talk about orca intelligence too. And
Yeah.
I was kind of equating the two. Oh, okay, dolphins, I've always been told they're super intelligent. Orcas must be super intelligent too. And I like this quote that you had in the book about it was some scientist, I believe, who said they're smart, but they're not that smart. And I was wondering if you can touch on that a little bit.
It all depends on how you define intelligence. And then that's kind of the problem with saying, are they smarter than us? Are we smarter than them? Um, we have very different ways of defining intelligence than they do. Um, they For us, intelligence is sort of indicated by your ability to manipulate abstract objects as well as materials in the world, and to construct things, and to devise means for survival and means for feeding and that sort of thing, and not just devise societies. um, and for orcas, there for them, intelligence would include the ability to see inside objects, to see inside each other, to see where everything is in their surroundings by sending out pings, because that's what a lot of their brain power is devoted to, is their echolocation sense. And so for them, intelligence would definitely, I mean, they are the most acoustically sophisticated animals on the planet. And so their intelligence also includes this ability to communicate through acoustics in ways that we can't even dream of, that we can't even really comprehend. Right. So in in acoustics and in other realms, um, orcas are way more intelligent than us. In our realms, in the areas that we sort of anthropomorphically designate the indications of intelligence, we do better. I think there's a very anthropocentric approach to intelligence that we use for these, for kind of sorting this stuff out. But what I can tell you is that um, no matter what, the orcas have the second largest brain on the planet, second only to sperm whales. And their brain is the most gyrified brain, which is to say, it has the most cortical folding of any brain on the planet. More so even than their next closest is bottlenose dolphins. Humans have a gyrification index of about 2.2, which is pretty high for a land mammal. Um, orcas gyrification index is 5.7. just ridiculous amount of folding, and they have lobes in their brains that we don't even understand what they're there for. But they indicate that they could be lobes capable of sensing emotional states and that sort of thing. We just don't really know. And but yeah, if you think of a brain as a computer chip capable of processing data, that's what scarification measures. That's what the cortical folding measures, because the more folds there are, the more neurons you have, and the longer those neurons are, the more data that brain is capable of processing. Uh, so yeah, orcas have far and away the largest CPU on the planet, and it's not even close. So, but a lot of that brain power, a lot of that ability to calculate really is directed into their echolocation function. Most of their brain fibers are acoustic fibers. And this is why, this is why it's kind of, you know, are they smarter than us? Yeah, in some ways. I mean, it's Lori Marino said, I quote her in the book as saying, um, orcas are not necessarily the best humans, but humans are terrible orcas too.
And when you mention echolocation, is this like on the same level of what I think of, I guess, in our world on land, like when a bat is flying through the night? Is it similar?
Well, see, so when bats do, and yeah, bats are capable of using similar acoustic sensing methods. They're just locating objects purely. When what we've found about orcas is that their echolocation gives, and part of this is, of course, their incredible brain power, get, sends back to them basically a picture, a sonogram. And so they're capable of not only sensing and seeing where objects are, they can see inside those objects. So they know when another member of the pod is pregnant. They know when someone's sick. They seem to be able to sense moods and that sort of thing using this echolocation sense. It's really incredible and subtle uh, and really sublime sort of sense that we're so incapable of it. We do know that blind people, for instance, can do this technique. Some blind people are known to use clicks as a way of, when they walk around, they can tell where people are. So humans can develop this sense, but for us, it's incredibly crude compared to what killer whales do. And of course, they've been evolving it for 6 million years. So there's a reason they're the most acoustically sophisticated animals.
Is their communication like with each other, like their when they're talking to each other, is that
Mm-hmm.
also um, complex and complicated? Are they able to tell other orcas, "Hey, you go over here, I'll go over here"?
Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of research on all this. It's not an area that promises a lot of profits for anybody. So there's not a lot of money to go around for research into orca acoustics. Um, but we do know that, yeah, typically, so what we have is, say, among the southern resident orcas here, in J, K, and L pods, it's comprised of three pods, J's, K's, and L's. And each of those pods has a somewhat distinct set of calls, but they also have a lot of shared calls. For instance, the J pod's famous call is called S1. And you really hear it quite regularly when they're in the vicinity. And it has a certain lilt to it that people who are familiar with it can quickly recognize. But it's surrounded, of course, by a whole lot of clicks and whistles and other kinds of other calls that they make. Typically, the repertoire of at least resident orcas that we've studied each pod has a repertoire of about 40 to 45 discrete calls. And there is, but there's a theory about that, that what, you'll hear frequently out there is that they will sit there and repeat that S1 call, but will have variations in it. And if you look at the sonograms of those repeated S1 calls, you can see the variations. And so it's possible, and there's a physicist who lives here on the island named Val Viers, his hypothesis is that they're actually transmitting information through these variations, sort of in the same way that an FM signal uh, is all an FM radio signal will work mostly through actually the variations in the signal rather than the signal itself. And that's yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing to think about, because then you realize they're operating on a whole different level than we're even capable of tuning in on and figuring out, that that's how they're communicating with each other, through these incredibly sophisticated means. But that also tracks with what we know about these animals, because they've been evolving these acoustic senses for millions of years.
And is the way to hear orcas communicating and calling, do you have to place a device in the water to hear that?
Yeah, yeah. When I have a hydrophone myself. It's a hydrophone. It's just a waterproof microphone that's attached to a wire, and I run it up into my recorder. Um, I
That
can I will when we're done here today, I'll send you some files of vocal recordings that I've made,
oh, that'd
so
be
you can hear
awesome.
what they sound like,
Yeah.
and you can play them for your audience.
Oh, that'd be cool. Yeah. What is it like when you are in the water and you're surrounded by these creatures? I gotta imagine it's a very, I gotta imagine
It's
it's a
scary
crazy,
as hell.
yeah.
No, I do. I mostly, when I encounter them these days, I tend to be on land. I go to places where I know that they frequent and I can see them from land. But I still do go out and kayak quite a bit. I don't go out kayaking with the intent of seeing orcas, but I always kind of hope they will show up. Um, and yeah, I've been doing it for quite a few years. And I got to say, universally, even though I've been doing it for years, when they show up, my whole body just goes, because it's like, that's a big 6 foot fin, and this animal weighs 32,000 is 32 feet long, weighs 14,000 pounds, and can kill me if he wants to instantly. I mean, it's just a very much a natural sort of physical reaction you have to them. And I have to do deep breaths and get my heart rate down to normal and that sort of thing. And I also make sure that I'm out of their path. That's an important thing. If you're going to be around these animals, you have to behave ethically around them so you don't interfere with their hunting or anything else they're doing. Um, but yeah, it's a really profound experience, because you suddenly realize you're just a tiny little flesh speck in the universe out there. And there are these huge creatures that are incredibly smart and incredibly powerful, and make us look very, very, very puny indeed. So,
And yeah, I gotta imagine, like in a compromised situation like that, if you're in a kayak, my brain goes to, well, there has to, in the history, there has to have been some incident where an orca has injured somebody. But from what I've gathered, there's really nothing in the wild, right?
correct. There was an incident down in California back in the early 70s where a surfer, was laying on a surfboard out in Monterey, and he got mistaken for a seal. Orca came up and grabbed his leg, pulled him under, and promptly let him go, because he realized, oh, this is not a seal.
Wow.
And the guy swam up. He had the orca bite attest to his encounter. He had to go to the hospital and get treated. Um, but that's the only encounter. There are odd little incidents that have happened throughout the years, including attacks on boats. There was a sailboat that was attacked in the Galapagos in the early 70s by a family that was on the sailboat, and their sailboat got attacked and sunk by a pod of orcas who had no interest in the crazy monkeys on board the boat. They just wanted to sink the boat and swam away after it sank. Similarly, there was the famous whaleboat Essex that was the basis of the whole Moby Dick story. It was based on a true story. The whaleboat Essex, who was sunk by a large sperm whale, and the crew took to the lifeboats, and they wound up having it was an incredible tale of survival because they were at sea for 40, 50 days. And they and on the second night that they were out, one of their lifeboats got attacked by an orca, and it ripped off a piece of the lifeboat, and then swam away. So there are odd incidents that have happened throughout history, but they've never actually attacked and killed a human being in the wild. It's just they've attacked and killed trainers when they're in captivity. So
Yeah, I was just about to go there now. Yeah, captivity is like a completely different story. And
mhm.
do do we know like the exact number of how many orcas have attacked people in captivity?
Uh, yeah, well, no, partly because SeaWorld has kept a real tight lid on any data about actual attacks on their trainers. They deny it, and they've only had to admit it when they actually killed a trainer, right? But over the years, SeaWorld orcas have attacked a number of trainers in a number of incidents, um, or at least harmed and injured these trainers, which is why finally, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration finally put down the law and said, no, your trainers cannot swim with these animals anymore. The thing about orcas is that they will swim 100 miles a day in the wild. They're used to extreme wide range. And so when they're put in these tiny tanks, it's an incredible act of deprivation because you're depriving them of the space they need. You're depriving them of their society, their culture, and for orcas, their bonds to their fellow pod members and their family members is really profound. As I say, that one of the realities of echolocation is that they have incredibly intimate social bonds. They see inside each other. They know each other, and they live with each other all their lives. So one brain scientist that I spoke to said that, yeah, in a situation like that, their sense of self is going to be, and their identity is going to be radically different than ours, and it's going to be really bound up inextricably with all the other members of their pods. So when you take them out of those pods and put them in these tanks, you're depriving them of space, you're depriving them of their culture, you're acoustically depriving them because you're putting them in these little concrete enclosures that do nothing but echo back. And indeed, most orcas in captivity really cut down on the amount of echolocation that they do because it doesn't make any sense for them. They don't need to do that much echolocation, and they'll vocalize less too, unless there are members of they're able to develop a sort of captive pod among themselves, and then they start speaking to each other. So yeah, you're depriving them in multiple ways, and it's really um, not surprising, especially with an animal that intelligent, that they would become incredibly frustrated and act out in anger. In fact, I think it speaks to the animals themselves that they haven't killed every trainer they ever came into contact with. At some point, you would think that they would act out. Certainly, if they were humans, they would have been acting out a lot more. And so it speaks to their incredible patience and mercifulness that they haven't.
Besides SeaWorld, what other companies here in the US have orcas in captivity?
None anymore. So the last non SeaWorld orca in captivity just passed away last year. They called her Lolita. She was at the Miami Seaquarium. She was the last surviving member of the Pacific Northwest orcas that was captured in the 1960s and 70s. Most of they took 58 animals out of this population up here. Most of them died within the first 5 years. And a number of them managed to survive into the 80s and even early 90s. But by mid 90s, there was really only one survivor left from the southern residents, and that was Lolita, aka Tokite, which is the name that she was given before she was captured, or right when she was captured was her Native American name is Tokite, and that's what most of the people who have respect for that animal call her, because Lolita was a disgusting name. I mean, she was a 3-year-old calf, and they put her in with an adult male in this tank named Hugo. Of course, they didn't have any actual sexual interaction because they weren't capable of it. But yeah, it was, the swinging Miami in the early 70s. Ooh, we got a little Lolita hanging out in the tank with Hugo. It's this disgusting name that they never should. It was show name. But anyway, so I call her Toki. And yeah, she passed away last year at the age of, I think she was about 55. And there was a program to try to return her to the Northwest, to retire her to a cove out here where she could be cared for and have, her natural waters around her. But she developed a lung infection and passed away in September of last year. So.
And SeaWorld itself, and I have been to SeaWorld way when I was younger, but how many locations do they have in the US?
They have three. They have one in Orlando, one in San Antonio, and one in San Diego.
Okay. And
Yeah.
um
And they do have one. They actually do in San Diego. They have a northern resident who's now the oldest captive caught, or formerly wild orca that is from the Northwest, named Corky. She is a northern resident from northern Vancouver Island. But there's still a campaign to try to help retire Corky. She's about the same age. She was captured the same year, almost the same month as Toki was, and she's getting up there in years. Uh, she certainly can't be returned to the wild because she's worn all of her teeth down, unlike Toki, who still had her teeth intact. But you know, it's still, she'll have to be under human care for the rest of her life. But at least it would be nice if she weren't stuck in a concrete tank somewhere doing it. So,
you know what's so crazy is that I do remember going to SeaWorld when I was younger, and I've seen the movie Free Willy, and I had stuffed animals that were
mhm.
orcas, and never really thought too much about it until this documentary film comes out called Blackfish, and my whole world turned upside down. Like, oh my gosh, I had no idea about all these things that were happening. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, and just how big was that movie in regards to like this topic?
Yeah, actually, there's kind of a history of cinema affecting um, popular attitudes about killer whales. It's important to remember that before the 60s, we feared these animals like nothing else. And so the real sea change first happened in, I think it was 67 or 68 with the movie My Friend Namu, which was a Ivan Tors production. And it featured the first captive, the successful captive orca, a guy named Namu, who lived for a year and a half at the Seattle Aquarium before he passed away. And he was a northern resident from northern British Columbia, or from northern Vancouver Island. But he that was it was a typical Ivan Tors thing with a young girl getting to befriend the orca, and oh, he's now my friend, and blah 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 blah. And, this is the kind of thing Ivan Tors did. He before that he did Flipper, right? So he was trying to do for orcas what he did for dolphins with Flipper, only it wasn't as successful. The movie flopped pretty badly. And it was actually filmed up here on San Juan Island, at least part of it. Um, but um, but it was the first film that made people, and it was part of what happened with captivity, is that, oh, we suddenly realized these are not big scary animals. These are really benign things that are curious about us and don't actually harm us unless we do stupid stuff like try to get in the water with them. But they Yeah, that was there. So there was this whole sea change in attitudes about killer whales, and pretty soon we had Shamu dolls. Everybody got to take their Shamu stuffy pluff, the home from SeaWorld, and yeah, and then of course, and so it went along that way that we had this sudden change in attitude about killer whales and started seeing them as benign creatures who might even be our friends. And then comes along Free Willy in what, 1991, I think, 92. Um, and it took it an even step further by suggesting that we would really befriend them by setting them free. And that was the whole point of the movie. And of course, the captive orca industry hated that movie because that was not what they wanted, this message they wanted the public to be getting, that no, you can't. And honestly, no, you really couldn't just free an orca by having it jump over a a breakwater. Um, but it had this, the thing about Free Willy was that it further really underscored the sort of nature of these animals, and how and the nature of our relationship with them. That it could be benign and we could be their friends, but you just don't want to put them in captivity for the rest of their lives. And that was sort of the beginning of the anti-captivity movement that came out of that. There was this effort to get Keiko, who was the killer whale who played Willie in the movie, um, have him freed from his really horrendous conditions down in Mexico City, and millions of school kids raised money to free Willie or to free Keiko, and there was a large corporate effort to join in on that, and indeed they did. They built a big tank for him up here in Newport, Oregon, and flew him up from Mexico City, put him in the tank. He rehabilitated there for a year, lost his papilloma virus. He had this virus, these caused scales on his skin. That was really a product of the poor conditions in Mexico City. And the tank in Newport was incredible. Allowed him to dive deep. It was fresh water. It was large, lots of room to roam, and it was a pretty cool tank. And then owner of the tent got caught trying to turn the water filters off so that his papillomavirus would come back because she was too addicted to having the uh, ticket sales from people coming to see Keiko. And she wanted to keep Keiko at the facility. And the people in charge of Keiko figured this out and said, okay, we're done here. And they moved him up to the pen that they had been preparing up in Iceland, got him out of that situation. And then they rehabilitated him for, a good 3 or 4 years in Iceland. He became as large as he ever was. He learned how to hunt, was fat and happy, and had a very large pen in which to roam. And eventually would start taking walks out in the wild, little swims out in the wild, and then he'd come back to his pen. And they introduced him to wild orcas. Unfortunately, they never were able to find his original family because they had no records of where his family was or who his family was, and they never were able to make that connection, which probably would have made a difference in terms of his long-term rehabilitation. But on one of these walks, he went out with the wild pod, and he didn't come back. He just went with him, and he went. They had a tracker on him, and so they were able to track his movements. And he wound up um, over in Norway, in a fjord in Norway. He broke off from the pod at one point and just went over to this fjord in Norway where there were a few villagers in this remote town, and he'd come into the fjord there and thrill the children because he was seeking human company. That's what he had been accustomed to since he was a cat. So, so the crew that had been in Iceland flew up, reset at camp in the fjord, and they resumed his care there, though they really didn't have a pen for him or anything. He just came and went as he wanted to, but they were able to give him medication and make sure he stayed healthy. And, right up to just before he died, he seemed perfectly healthy. And this happens with captive orcas a lot, that one day they develop what a condition they call peanut head, which is a sunken area behind the skull. That's really a harbinger of imminent death for these animals. And it's usually related to respiratory diseases, which they believe is what he died of. Unfortunately, when he did die a few days later, they pulled his body up and put him under care, and the people in charge of him refused to allow a necropsy to be done, which is really unfortunate because we needed to know what he died from. But I think that it's a fairly safe presumption to say that he probably died of the respiratory illness that many, if not all, captive orcas die from, which it seems to be a condition that they develop in captivity, frequently carry for the rest of their lives, and then it eventually develops a sort of fatal uh, apotheosis. So
How much can a orca go for, or like in the heyday, uh, how much were people paying for orcas that were captured?
millions.
Oh,
I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Remember this. They get now, mind you, in the 60s and 70s, they were just paying hundreds of dollars. But by the time in the mid 70s, and especially after they shut down the captures here in Washington State and in Canada, they moved the operations to Iceland, the capture operations to Iceland. And it was a bunch of the same guys who were capturing orcas down here who were doing it up in Iceland. And by the time they were capturing those orcas, they were getting millions of dollars for them because they were proven money makers by then. And the people who wanted them were willing and able to pay that much money for them. So yeah, back in the mid to late 60s, the price was quite a bit lower because they didn't really know. And honestly, they still had no idea how to handle or deal with these animals. So it was one of those things that, yeah, the market value on them went up markedly. But and nowadays, they're reviving the captive orca marine park industry in China. And my understanding is that the orcas that they are using in those facilities, they are indeed paying millions of dollars for. So,
And,
because
and
they draw huge crowds. They draw huge crowds.
mhm,
I mean, before I knew any better, I went to SeaWorld a couple times too. So,
mhm. It-
yeah, and Blackfish absolutely changed the whole ethos around uh, captivity. It really made people aware that, ultimately, I mean, I think the real final message is of Blackfish is that these animals, captivity is not an appropriate thing for these animals. They do not belong in captivity, and there are a number of animals that will thrive and do fine in captivity, but killer whales are not among them.
mhm.
So.
I did we see when a movie like that, Blackfish, first came out, did these companies take a while to kind of own up to what they were doing, or did they try to
Yeah.
make like sweep things under the rug?
Yeah, well, first they ignored them. They tried to ignore Blackfish away. Oh, this is just some crazy documentary, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly it had millions of viewers, mainly because it showed up on CNN. It was a CNN sponsored film. And so suddenly they were faced with this tsunami of bad publicity. And so then they fought back by trying. First, of course, they smeared the filmmakers and smeared the people who were the trainers who appeared, former SeaWorld trainers who appeared in the film. They smeared them, um, and it's, oh, those are just bad people trying to make names for themselves and make money or whatever. And then they put out a they put out this guide for their audience called "The Truth About Blackfish." That was this incredible litany of nonsense and misrepresented research and straight up lies. And at one point in the response, they said they actually said, "Oh, well, there's no indication that orcas remain with their mothers their entire lives. This is not sound, and it had in fact been scientifically established for about 20 years that, yeah, orcas have matriarchal societies, and most of the time both males and females remain with their mothers their entire lives. um but and this is sort of typical of, I mean, here's the sort of, I mean, one of the tragedies of SeaWorld's tenure as stewards of these killer whales is that they did almost no research on. We had these animals in our possession, and we've learned incredibly little about them other than issues of reproduction, because they were interested in breeding them. So they know all about how to breed these animals and what works and what doesn't in terms of, getting them pregnant and making the pregnancy work and that sort of thing. Um, it's like they're cattle. It's like the same knowledge that we have about cows and pigs. Um, it's all very sort of agricultural. And at the same time, we've learned just zero about their intelligence, zero about their acoustic capacities, zero about, because no, the animals were too busy performing for anybody to be able to conduct any research on them in the first place. And so, yeah, the lack of research and the lack of actually scientific data that we've gotten out of this whole capture period is really kind of tragic to me, because yeah, if you're going to take these animals captive, you should get something more out of it than money, you know. And unfortunately, That's all they've got.
Yeah, the what is today? What what is the state of a company like SeaWorld? Is it, do you know, like, is it still doing well? Is it still profitable, or has it hurt since then?
Actually, SeaWorld's, particularly their Orlando facility, both most of their facilities now are theme parks that have rides. And a lot of their revenue production is built around the rides because they've found that the orcas don't have the draw that they used to have because a lot of people stay away from them because they have orcas who are captive and these people have seen blackfish, right? It's become definitely a sort of uncool thing to go to SeaWorld and help their bottom line. So they've built ways of building their revenue around it, but also their ownership has changed. It was SeaWorld was owned for a while by Anheuser-Busch, which then sold to the Blackstone Group, which is a venture capital or company, and then Blackstone about 34 years ago sold to a company from China. And so now SeaWorld's facilities are being connected to these new marine parks that are going up in China. They haven't traded any whales yet or any animals yet that we know of. But yeah, they now have an ownership group that is no longer based in North America.
In your career, have you spoken to trainers at SeaWorld or some of these marine parks?
Yeah. I talked to trainers both at Orlando. Well, not trainer. I should at Orlando. I didn't talk to a trainer. I just talked to um, their one of their guides that's trained on how to spew propaganda and nonsense. And but the trainer, I talked to a couple of the trainers at Miami Seaquarium because I was inquiring about Toki. And I went there to see her a couple times and I talked to her trainers, and I would invite these trainers to come up to San Juan Island and see these animals in the wild because once you see that, you can't unsee it. Once you see orcas swimming free in the wild, when you go back to that, especially Toki's tank, which was the tiniest little tank in North America. It was just ridiculously small. You go back and see them swimming in those tanks, and you just know that it's wrong. It's just plain. And so, and they all resist. No, no, I don't need to go up there and see them. And they, in fact, part of their spiel that they would give to their audience the last time I went uh, was they weren't able to swim with Toki anymore. First time I went, they were still climbing on her and doing all the stunts and having Toki lift them out of the water and riding around on her and that sort of thing. Um, the second time I went, OSHA had come down and said you can't do this anymore. So they developed this sort of performative thing. It was just deadly boring. And the most boring part was that most of it was this like long lecture about how Lolita really belongs here with us. We're her family now. And the Northwest, the open ocean is a scary place and all kinds of things can happen up there. You know, and yeah, I was highly amused, but by that whole approach. And yeah, of course, that all ended. I think it ended around the pandemic. They closed performances down and kept her in a tank, and then the effort to relocate her got serious. Uh, Seaquarium had been owned by Hertz, the Hertz family, Hertz rent a car family, for years, and then in the end, they got bought most recently by outfit called the Dolphin Company, and the Dolphin Company, as soon as they bought it, said, "Yeah, we want to move Lolita. We don't want to keep her as an asset." And SeaWorld had no interest in her, as an asset. She wouldn't have been able to fit in with any of their pods. So, so the and Jim Irsay, the owner of the Indianapolis Colts, stepped up with the millions of dollars to try to make this move happen. And yeah, it's just really tragic, and it still makes me sad and angry to this day that after 50 years in captivity, she showed incredible strength and resilience. She was an amazing animal. I mean, to live that long in captivity. And, when I visited her, you could still see that she had the intelligence in her eyes and was still alert and looking around. She seemed to recognize people who knew what was going on because she came right over to me and like hung out with me and let me take her picture for about 15 minutes. Um, and I remember a lot of the seaquariums clients in those days were people who had just gotten off the cruise ships, uh, tourists from other countries, and particularly South America. And there was this guy, tourist from Colombia, came up as I was taking her picture and looking at her, and he says, "So is this the only tank that, or this is just like a show tank, right? They have another place they keep her at night, or a bigger tank?" And I said, "No, this is where she's been for 50 years." And he just shook his head because anybody who could see that tank was, it was ridiculously small. Um, she couldn't dive to any depth at all, and it would only take her like two waves of her flukes to get from one side of the pool to the other. So, um, not much room there. So, yeah, so it was. But Toki, she was, yeah, everybody who knew anything about her would talk about how just she had this amazing strength and resilience. And yeah, it breaks my heart still to think about how close we came to getting her out of that and giving her a good life in her final years. Because, like I say, well, she was probably 55 when she died, but in the wild, these females live to 80, 90 years. So she would have been able to have had at least a decent quality of life for a few years, I think. Similar to what Keiko had. I mean, Keiko swam free. A lot of people say, well, the Keiko thing failed. Well, yeah, we didn't reunite him with his family successfully, and he didn't have a long life in the wild, but he did swim free. He was a wild orca when he died. And I think that says something. I think says something important. So
Do you think the public sentiment that took place here in the US as far as orcas, do you think eventually it will reach other countries that are starting to pick up on these orca operations? And like you said, they're increasing marine parks in certain areas of the world.
yeah. Well, I don't know that anything will make things better if the situation in China, but certainly in Russia, they're very sensitive. They built an orca facility, I think in St. Petersburg, that they then shifted gears after Blackfish came out and made it into primarily a dolphin facility and announced that they were not going to be bringing orcas in. Now, mind you, it's believed that a number of the orcas that are showing up in China were actually captured in Russian waters, possibly. We're not sure. They keep all that stuff in their extremely close wraps, and they're very sensitive about any of that information getting out. Kind of brings out the investigative journalist in me. I would like to dig into that some more, to tell you the truth. But yeah, the Russia backed away from doing captive facilities, and and they've talked about various times building orca facilities in places like Qatar, and some of these oil wealthy countries and that sort of thing. But Blackfish really kind of put the kibosh on a lot of that, and it's you know not considered socially appropriate anymore anywhere other than in China to keep these animals captive. So yeah, there haven't been any new facilities built, and the old ones are crumbling and losing money. So
Now, you mentioned that you have another book on whales coming up, and that one is going to be about humpback whales, you said?
yeah, yeah. Well, you didn't never used to see humpback whales in the Sailor Sea here back in the 80s and 90s when I first started coming out here. It was not even heard of. And then beginning about 2000, we started seeing one or two show up, and by 2010, we were seeing them quite regularly, and now we've accounted for something like 750 humpback whales in the last 10 years, 10, 15 years that they've identified, which is a pretty large number. And it's just part of, for me, it's a chance to do a cool story, a happy story, because it tells us that our efforts to sort of restore this endangered population, they can work. You know, if you get out of these animals' way, you stop taking their food away, and you stop capturing them or killing them, which is what we did with humpbacks for years. I mean, it turns out that when I started researching it, that actually humpback whales were very abundant in the Sailor Sea for most of its history. It was just in 1920 they set up a whaling station up in Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, and they extirpated the entire humpback population in 2 years. They killed hundreds of whales, and they just burn it down for blubber because there's still a demand for whale oil then, even though it had significantly fallen off. We used to use whale oil for street lamps in the U.S., and then finally they started using petroleum oil for street lamps and then electricity for street lamps. And um, and the main use for the whale oil, really the highest use for whale oil was as a machine oil in the Industrial Revolution, because the oil you could get out of a sperm whale's case, which is the large thing in the front of its head, is the finest machine oil known to man. We still haven't been able to make it anything as fine as that oil, even synthetically. But we can still make synthetic oil that doesn't require killing millions of animals to obtain it. That does the job just fine now, right? But back then, boy, that if you wanted to make those machines go, you had to have whale oil, and it had to be sperm whale oil. The humpbacks, they weren't getting the oil from the case because humpbacks don't have a case. They don't have cases were an acoustic lens similar to what orcas have in their front of their heads, up in that melon. It's a big oil sac that serves as a lens for their acoustic signals, their echolocation signals. And humpbacks don't have echolocation. They never had the need to evolve it, so they have extremely sensitive hearing, but they do not have the ability to echolocate. So those whales, even though they were bigger than a lot of them were even bigger than sperm whales, were nonetheless less useful until we didn't start really harvesting humpbacks until about the 1890s. And then it was just to boil their blubber down and get the somewhat cruder oil that we could get from their blubber. And that's what they did in the early 1900s when they extirpated the humpback population. And the memory of basically coming up through the Sailor Sea was a route for the migrating humpbacks from either Cabo or from Hawaii, because they come from both directions on their way up to Alaska. they could come into the Salish Sea and immediately begin feeding because there was a lot of food here for them. And on their way to Alaska, where the food's even more abundant. Um, so that apparently had fallen out of their, sort of collective memory until these humpbacks started showing up in the early 21st century. And it was a single female known as Big Mama, and she would bring a calf along. So it was, Big Mama and her calf, and she had several calves that she would wind up bringing into these waters. And then we started seeing other whales showing up. She obviously spread the word, and yeah, so now it's pretty common. I just was seeing a couple of them the other day off the lighthouse here. They're big animals. They're amazing, and they're kind of the anti-orcas. They're not voracious predators. They're very gentle and are known to some try to protect other species from orca attacks. They're antagonistic with orcas. For good cause, because orcas, especially up in Alaska, are known to prey on their calves. So,
Wow.
uh,
Well, I can't wait to read that book when it comes out. David, this has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for doing this.
you bet, Chris. So, yeah, if you need anything more, let me know. I hope we covered everything you wanted to cover.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think the thing about, I think if I wanted to think about what humpback can teach us as well as
Hmm.
what killer whales teach us, is that I think these are all really profoundly empathetic animals. And I think that empathy plays a really foundational role in their ability to survive and to maintain their places in the food chain and in the world, um, because of their empathy. And I often think about humans, because I do deal with right-wing extremists. And if you want to talk about the antithesis of that, let's talk about right-wing extremists, because I think it's fundamentally a lack of empathy. It's a failure of empathy that causes the most destructive human behavior and human traits. And um, I think the main thing we can learn from these animals is to try to learn how to not just be empathetic, but how to use empathy as a tool for our enhancement, our enrichment, and our survival.
And I would love to have you back on in the future to actually talk about your other books too. And that topic is very fascinating, and would love to have you back on, yeah, in the future.
Sure.
Um,
My pleasure, Chris.
and really quick, if people wanted to get a hold of you, I know you're on X, Twitter, but do you have a
Mhm.
website or any other social media?
I have a Substack site. It's called The Spy Hop. I haven't written on it for 3 months because I've been giving myself a writing break. I'm still recovering from 6 years of writing about Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, so I'm kind of like giving myself a little breather. But I'm actually about to start writing on it again. So, and I do use it, and people can contact me through the Substack, Spy Hop, as well as yeah, I send a tweet on Twitter under my name, and I usually respond. So,
Nice. And I'll include links to all these in the description of the episode. David, thank you again. And for everybody else out there, thank you very much for listening. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.